When the sun dipped below the horizon in medieval England, the world didn't just go dark, it disappeared. For a peasant or city dweller living without electricity, nightfall meant plunging into a thick, almost palpable darkness full of fears, superstitions, and real dangers. In this world, light was not just a convenience. It was synonymous with life, security, and civilization itself. We used to think of the Middle Ages as the Dark Ages, and in a domestic sense, this was true. Most people's lives were lived in the rhythm of the sun, rising with the dawn, going to bed with the sunset. But what if you had to deliver a cow in the middle of the night, fix a broken tool in the morning, or simply pass a long, dank winter evening when darkness lasts for 16 hours? How did these people, having neither kerosene lamps nor paraffin candles, wrest precious hours from the night? What ingenious in their simplicity and sometimes unexpected solutions did they use to light a flame in their humble homes? Today, we're going to look deep into that darkness and reveal 10 forgotten medieval English lighting techniques. Are you ready to learn how an ordinary reed was transformed into a light source for an entire evening? Why smoldering embers were just as important as a bright flame? And what mushroom could serve as a nightlight for a lost traveler? Stay tuned and you'll realize that fighting darkness was a true art, requiring knowledge, patience, and incredible ingenuity. For the vast majority of English peasants in the early and high Middle Ages, the question of lighting was a simple and non-alternative one. They had no choice between candles, lamps, or torches. There was only one source of light and warmth, a central open hearth. It was not just part of the interior, it was the sun around which the whole planet called family revolved. As the sun set, all life in the hut shrank to a small lighted circle around the fire. Outside this circle, there was almost absolute darkness, where only vague silhouettes could be seen. All the evening's work, all the socializing, all the eating, all took place here, in the patch lit by the dancing tongues of flame. Women spun or mended clothes, bringing their work as close to the fire as possible. Men sharpened tools or wove baskets. And children listened to stories, watching sparks fly into the chimney hole in the roof. The light from the hearth was lively but capricious. It was uneven. It blinked at any draft, casting bizarre, frightening shadows on the walls. It was dim, and to see anything small, you had to stoop very low, risking burns or smoke inhalation. The quality of the light depended directly on the quality of the wood. Dry hardwoods gave a bright, clean flame, while damp or rotten ones smoked and smoked, filling the already cramped room with acrid smoke. This smoke was not just an inconvenience, it was a slow killer. Constant inhalation of soot led to chronic lung disease. Coughing and acrid smoke caused inflammation and eye disease, which were the scourge of the era. The walls and thatched roof were covered from the inside with a thick layer of sticky black soot. But despite the smoke and danger, the fire had tremendous psychological power. It was not just a physical barrier, but a magical barrier against a hostile world. Beyond its shivering light stretched a darkness full of real predators and imaginary evil spirits. The circle of light from the hearth was a circle of safety, a sacred space where the family was protected. It was not uncommon to throw a pinch of salt or a drop of ale into the fire as a bloodless sacrifice to the guardian spirits of the house, to enlist their support for a long and dark night. This total dependence on a single source of light dictated the entire rhythm of life. There was no possibility of doing things in different corners of the house. Everyone was confined to the hearth. This created incredible crowding, but also incredible cohesion. The hearth was not just a heater, it was a social center, a place where the family felt united, protected from the darkness and cold of the outside world. At the same time, every member of the family knew from childhood that fire was not only a friend, but also a deadly threat. A single spark caught on dry straw could destroy the house and all the meager possessions in minutes. Being able to control the flames was the ultimate survival skill. But what if you needed to move away from the hearth or move a light to another part of the house? There was another, even more common and ingenious in its simplicity, light fixture for this purpose. If the wax candle was a symbol of wealth and church, its humble but ubiquitous counterpart in the homes of ordinary Englishmen was the rushlight, a lamp made from the heartwood of common marsh reeds. It was an ingenious technology that allowed you to get a light source literally from what grew underfoot and required almost no expense except for time and animal fat. The manufacturing process was painstaking. In the fall, peasants collected long, mature stalks of reeds. Then they had to be carefully peeled from the tough green skin, leaving only a thin strip for strength. This strip was critical. It served as a kind of spine for the fragile core, preventing it from breaking during impregnation and burning. It was a job requiring a steady hand and great patience, which girls were taught from an early age. A porous, white core was left inside. These blanks were carefully dried. The next step was to melt the fat, usually the cheapest lamb or beef fat, which was left over from the slaughter. The dried reed core was slowly dipped into the hot melted fat, allowed to soak, removed, and allowed to solidify. This procedure was repeated several times until the reed stick was covered with an even layer of fat. The result was a thin, flexible, and very fragile candle. It gave a dim, smoking light and burned out rather quickly, on average in 15 to 30 minutes. Making rushlights was often a collective activity on long fall evenings. The whole family from small to large would sit around the hearth. The children who gathered reeds from the marsh during the day helped to clean them, and the women, the main keepers of this craft, were engaged in the most responsible part, soaking in hot, foul-smelling fat. This was not just labor, but an important ritual in preparation for the long winter, a time when knowledge and skills were passed on from mother to daughter. To hold the rushlight, special metal stands were used. Rush nips, similar to tongs or clothespins on a leg. They allowed the reed lamp to be fixed at an angle, which was thought to slow down its burning. A family could procure hundreds of these rushlights for the winter by tying them into bundles and hanging them in a dry place. Despite all their disadvantages, dim light, smoke, unpleasant odor of burning fat, short life, rushlights were a real salvation for the poor. The smell of this light was unforgettable. The pungent, greasy spirit of mutton fat mixed with smoke. The flame was constantly crackling and spitting drops of hot lard, requiring to put a bowl of water or sand under the raisnip. And there was so little light. To illuminate a room for only 2 or 3 hours after sunset, a family had to burn half a dozen or even more of these candles. It was a true economy of light where every minute of burning counted. They made it possible to do small chores, light the way to the stable, or simply create the illusion of light in a dark hut. It was survival technology, the peak of ingenuity born of necessity. But even the most frugal rushlight would burn out. So how to keep the fire burning until morning without burning precious fuel? For this, there was another stratagem. The main task of the medieval householder was not so much to light a fire as to keep it burning. Fuel was precious, and the process of kindling with flint and crescents was labor-intensive. Therefore, the practice of preserving the fire overnight, known as curfew, from the Old French couvre-feu, to cover the fire, was ubiquitous. The term is not accidental. In many English towns and villages, a special fire-extinguishing bell, curfew bell, rang in the evenings. It was not just a bedtime bell, but an official fire safety measure in a world of wooden houses and thatched roofs. At this signal, every householder was obliged to dim his hearth to prevent nighttime fires. In this way, the personal stratagem of fuel conservation was woven into public safety. But this practice also had an unexpected side effect, a weak but constant source of nightlight. Before going to bed, when the main wood in the hearth had burned through, the master did not extinguish the fire completely. He would gather the largest, hottest coals into the center of the hearth and carefully cover them with a thick layer of ash. It was an art. You had to choose the right coals, from hardwoods like oak that smoldered long and hot. The layer of ash had to be not too thick so as not to smother the heat, but also not too thin so that the coals wouldn't burn out before morning. The ash cut off the oxygen, and the coals stopped burning brightly, going into a slow, economical smoldering mode. In this state, they could keep the heat and glow for 8 to 10 hours until the morning. It was this weak, deep, ruby glow of smoldering coals under the ashes that was the main nightlight in the medieval house. It didn't provide enough light to read or work, but it was enough to dispel the absolute disorienting darkness. In its ghostly light, you could make out the contours of furniture, find a door, walk to a cradle with a baby without bumping into anything. This light was also a psychological defense. It gave the feeling that the heart of the house was not dead, but just sleeping. The quiet living glow in the middle of the night silence was soothing, warding off fears and night creatures, both real and imagined. Waking up in the middle of the night, a man would see that familiar red light and realize that he was home, safe. In the morning, it was enough to rake the ashes, put some dry firewood, moss or shavings, on the smoldering embers, and carefully fan them to make the fire flare up again. The morning revival of the fire was almost a sacred ritual. The mistress of the house, even in the pre-dawn twilight, came to the hearth, carefully raked the warm ashes, and seeing the live, pulsating embers, exhaled with relief. A light whiff, and the first tongue of flame licked the dry moss, marking the victory over the darkness of the night and the beginning of a new day. This saved an enormous amount of time and effort. Smoldering embers were thus an ingenious dual-purpose solution. They kept the fire burning until morning and served as a permanent, safe, and completely free nightlight. But brighter light required liquid fuel, and here the English used what their farm and the sea gave them. Although rushlights were popular, the medieval English used oil lamps for more stable and longer-lasting illumination. But the fuel for these was not expensive olive oil, as in the Mediterranean, but what was in abundance: animal and fish oil. These light sources were efficient, but had one major drawback: a disgusting odor. The most common fuel was tallow, clarified beef or mutton fat. It was relatively abundant in any farm where cattle were kept. The fat was melted, cleaned of impurities, and poured into simple lamps. These could be stone pots, as in antiquity, or the more common clay or iron cruci lamps, open vessels with a spout for the wick. The design of these lamps was ingenious in its simplicity. They often consisted of two bowls placed one above the other. The upper bowl contained the fuel and the wick, while the lower bowl served to collect drops of melted fat that inevitably dripped from the wick. This not only prevented fire and dirt, but also allowed every drop of precious fuel to be used sparingly, returning it back into the lamp. The tallow burned quite brightly but smoked heavily and spread a heavy, unpleasant odor of burning fat. In coastal areas from Cornwall to Northumbria, fish oil, especially cod liver oil, was widely used. It was very cheap and gave a bright, strong flame. But its odor was even worse than that of lard. The pungent, piercing stench soaked everything in the house, seeped into the walls, clothes, and hair. Living and working under the light of such a lamp was a real challenge to the sense of smell. Controlling such a lamp required constant attention. The wick, made of twisted cloth or moss, had to be constantly adjusted. As the fuel burned out, it had to be pulled forward a little at a time to keep the flame burning. If it was pulled forward too far, the lamp began to smoke mercilessly, covering everything around with a layer of greasy soot. If it was too weak, the flame became as dim as the eye of a sick sheep and threatened to go out. It was a delicate balance that the lady of the house maintained throughout the evening. Despite the odor, these lamps were indispensable. They gave much more light than the rushlight and burned longer. By the light of such a lamp, one could do crafts, mending nets, working leather, sharpening tools. They were used in workshops, blacksmith shops, taverns, wherever a relatively bright and stable light was needed. Sometimes aromatic herbs such as wormwood, juniper, and mint were added to the grease to break the unpleasant odor. This did not always help, but it made the atmosphere in the house a little more bearable. There was a better, though expensive, fuel, whale oil, which could be bought in port towns. It burned almost odorlessly and gave a clean, bright flame. But for a simple peasant, it was an unfulfilled luxury. The art of lighting was also the art of combating odors. But how to direct this dim, smelly light where it was needed and make it even a little brighter? And on that score, medieval man had his own tricks. In the dark, almost windowless architecture of the early Middle Ages, any strip of light that penetrated from the outside was worth its weight in gold. English builders, perhaps intuitively, or perhaps based on ancient knowledge, sometimes used an ingenious technique that might be called the moonbeam window. This was not a window in our sense, but rather a strategically placed opening designed to catch the light. Unlike ordinary windows, which served for a view, these openings, sometimes called luce or wind eye for the wind, which is the root of the word window, were often placed high on the wall, under the roof itself, especially on the south or west side of the house. They were made narrow and deep, with slopes extending inward. This shape was ingenious. The narrow outer opening minimized the penetration of rain and cold wind, while the wide inner jambs worked like a funnel, catching light from a large patch of sky and scattering it around the room. In this way, even a small opening could provide a surprising amount of soft, diffused light without creating a strong draft. During the day when the sun was high, no direct light would enter such a window, but it would catch the diffused light from the sky, creating a soft, even illumination in the room without harsh shadows. But its real magic was at night. The narrow opening was perfectly positioned to catch the light of the full moon. On a clear night, a column of moonlight streaming through such a window would fall to the floor, creating an almost mystical, silvery spot in the pitch blackness of the hut. Moreover, this spot of light served as a primitive but reliable clock and calendar for the family. By day, moving across the earthen floor, it marked the passage of time, indicating noon and the time for evening work. And from month to month, as the altitude of the sun above the horizon changed, so did the angle of the beam. An experienced owner could determine by the position of the solar bunny on the wall the approach of sowing or reaping. This was a connection of the house not only with light, but also with the cosmic rhythm of the seasons. This light was not enough for work, but it was enough to orient in space, to see the silhouettes of sleeping people, to feed an infant. Moonlight, unlike fire, was cold, safe, and completely free. It required no fuel, did not smoke, and posed no fire hazard. Folklore and legends often mention rays of light falling into dark rooms and pointing to treasures or holy places. Perhaps behind these stories is the actual practice of using such architectural light traps. To a medieval man whose life was full of superstition, such a ray of moonlight might have seemed a true miracle, a divine sign. In a cramped, down-to-earth hut, smelling of smoke and earth, this pure, unearthly column of light falling from the sky was perceived as a direct gaze of God or a patron saint, as a blessing that sanctified their humble existence. This artifice demonstrates that lighting was not only a matter of technology, but also of architecture. A properly placed hole in the wall could do more good than a few smoking rash lights, but it was also possible to amplify the light from an ordinary fire by using simple but effective reflective surfaces. With every light source dim and precious, medieval Englishmen intuitively used the laws of physics to amplify it. The simplest reflective surfaces placed near a fire could double, if not triple, the illumination in a room. It was an ingenious trick that required almost no expense. The simplest reflector was the wall behind the hearth. They tried to whitewash it with lime or chalk. White light surface reflected much more light from the flame than dark, smoky walls, making the room lighter and visually more spacious. But this practice had a second, equally important function. The lime whitewash had weak antiseptic properties, preventing mold growth on damp walls and making the air in the cabin a little healthier. Thus, one simple act, whitewashing, solved two problems at once. It multiplied precious light and fought the ubiquitous dampness. This practice was common everywhere, from peasant huts to castle halls. Special reflectors were used to amplify the light from a candle or oil lamp. In wealthy homes, these could be sheets of polished metal, pewter, bronze, or even silver. Such a shiny sheet installed behind the candle worked as a mirror, directing the light in the right direction and making it brighter. In wealthier homes or monasteries, these reflectors became real art. They were not just flat sheets, but special wall-mounted candlesticks known as sconces, where the polished metal plate behind the candle often had a concave shape. This design not only reflected but focused the light, creating a directional beam that was convenient for reading or needlework. But simple peasants had little metal, therefore they used what was at hand. For example, an ordinary clay bowl, whitened from the inside, or even a large white sea clam placed behind the rushlight already gave a noticeable effect. Sometimes a piece of polished, light-colored stone or bone was used. Any light-colored, smooth surface could serve as a reflector, but there was another living reflector: the people themselves. Gathering in a tight circle around the hearth, dressed in their light linen shirts, their bodies and faces caught and reflected the light of the flames onto each other, creating a more illuminated and intimate space. The circle of people itself became part of the lighting system. Another trick was the use of water. A bowl of clean water placed in front of the candle worked like a lens, diffusing and slightly intensifying the light, making it softer and more even. This helped to reduce harsh shadows and create a cozier atmosphere. These simple techniques demonstrate the incredible observation and ingenuity of medieval people. They had no scientific knowledge of optics, but they understood its basic laws in practice. The ability to multiply light was as important a skill as the ability to obtain it. But sometimes light was needed not in the house but outside, and this required other, more dangerous devices. When it was necessary to travel outside the house at night, to walk from the hut to the stable, to meet a late guest, or to take part in a night procession, the dim light of a rushlight or lamp was not enough. The street required a powerful, bright, and windproof source of light, and that source was most often a torch. But the medieval torch had little in common with the elegant mashals of the movies. The most common type of torch in the wooded areas of England was that made from pine. So-called fat wood, fat pine, was found, part of the trunk or root of an old pine tree that was heavily impregnated with resin. This resinous wood burned very brightly, hot and long, almost unafraid of wind and rain. A long beam of such wood could be used as a ready-made torch. Another way was to make a torch from a stick, on one end of which was wound a hemp or a piece of coarse cloth impregnated with a combustible substance. Most often it was the same pine tar, or tar, which was collected from trees and melted. Such impregnation provided a long and bright burning. However, torches had many disadvantages. They were extremely smoky. It was almost impossible to use them indoors. The room was instantly filled with acrid, choking smoke. The torch was strictly a street lamp. In addition, it was very flammable. Burning tar was constantly dripping from it, and sparks were flying in all directions. A man with a torch in his hands posed a threat to wooden buildings and thatched roofs. That is why night torchlight processions, although they looked spectacular, often ended in fires. Despite the danger, torches were indispensable for night work, for lighting the way for guards on the castle walls, for military signals. The bright, living light of the torch dispelled not only darkness, but also fear, creating a sense of power and control over the night elements. But not only people created light, sometimes the source of light was their work itself. In a medieval village or town, there were places that, even on the darkest night, were illuminated by light. These were the workshops of artisans whose work was inextricably linked to fire, primarily blacksmiths and potters. Fire in their pots and kilns was not only a production necessity, but also a powerful source of illumination. The forge was a real beacon in the village at night. The red-hot metal in the furnace, the sparks flying from under the blacksmith's hammer, the flames on the walls and tools. All this created a bright, almost theatrical lighting. The blacksmith often worked late into the night to fulfill an urgent order, and the light of his forge was visible from afar, serving as a landmark for late travelers. For the blacksmith himself, this light was a byproduct of his work. It allowed him to see what he was doing without the use of additional lights. Moreover, by the color of the glowing metal, the skilled craftsman could determine its temperature, which was key to quality forging. Fire was his working tool and his lamp at the same time. A similar picture was observed in pottery workshops during the firing of pottery. A large wood-fired kiln, heated to red hot, emitted not only intense heat, but also a bright light that illuminated the entire workshop in the surrounding area. Firing nights were a special event that required constant attention and supervision, and took place by the light of the kiln itself. Light from craft furnaces at coal miners, glass blowers, bakers, also played a role in the lighting of medieval settlements. These industrial sources of light, though localized, contributed to the overall fight against the darkness of night. They were symbols of labor, of creation, and of the indomitable energy of fire that man had learned to put at his service. But sometimes in the very midst of the forest, you could find a light that was not man-made. Deep in the dark, damp medieval forest, far from human habitation, there was another most mysterious and enigmatic source of light. It wasn't a candle or a campfire. It was a foxfire, or magic glow, a cold, ghostly, greenish-blue glow that came from rotting wood. This phenomenon, which we today call bioluminescence, was caused by a special kind of fungus, e.g. honeydew opencus, that grew on dead trees. The mycelium of this fungus penetrating the wood emitted a faint but visible glow in total darkness during its vital activity. For a medieval man unfamiliar with biology, it was a real miracle or a manifestation of magic. A traveler or hunter lost in the forest could stumble upon such a glowing stump or log and use it as a natural nightlight. This light gave no heat and was too weak to work by, but it dispersed absolute darkness, allowed to see the outlines of objects, and gave great psychological relief. To find such a foxfire in the forest was considered a good omen. Around this phenomenon, of course, there were many superstitions and legends. It was believed to be the light of fairies, elves, or the souls of the undead. Some believed it pointed to hidden treasures or, conversely, trapped travelers. It was a light from another, otherworldly world, frightening and alluring at the same time. Nevertheless, the practicality of it was undeniable. A piece of glowing rotten wood could be taken into the hut and used as a weak but perfectly safe, no fire required, nightlight to soothe a crying child, for example. This ingenious stratagem was pure observation and the ability to utilize even the most unusual gifts of nature. But back to more prosaic things. The most mass folk lamp was still a candle, but not from expensive wax, but from what everyone had. Although we often talk about candles in general, in medieval England there was a huge gulf between the expensive, fragrant wax candle and its ubiquitous but much less pleasant relative, the tallow candle. It was the tallow candle that was the main source of light for millions of peasants, artisans, and townspeople, and its use was associated with a number of inconveniences. The fuel for these candles was tallow, a clarified animal fat, most often mutton or beef. The manufacturing process was dirty and labor-intensive. The fat was melted in cauldrons, producing a foul-smelling mass, which was then repeatedly dipped into a wick. The wick, made of twisted hemp or linen, gradually grew layers of solidified fat, turning into a candle. The tallow candle burned unevenly, constantly sputtering and dripping hot fat. Its flame was dull, yellowish, and smoked heavily, filling the room with the acrid, unpleasant odor of burning fat. This odor was so distinctive that it could be considered the smell of poverty of the Middle Ages. The walls and ceiling in rooms where tallow candles were constantly burned were covered with a layer of greasy soot. In addition, the wick in a tallow candle burned out faster than the tallow itself, and it had to be constantly trimmed with special pliers. If this was not done, the flame became even bigger, began to smoke heavily, and could go out. That's why there always had to be tongs for removing the soot near the tallow candle. Despite all these disadvantages, tallow candles were the main artificial source of light for the majority of the population. They were cheap, and the raw material for them was available on any farm where livestock were kept. They made it possible to extend the daylight hours, to do household chores after sundown, and to avoid sitting in total darkness. It was a harsh but necessary reality. Medieval lighting is more than just fire in the dark. It is an entire culture of survival, a story of how people, through wit, patience, and incredible ingenuity, reclaimed hour after hour from the night. Every dim rushlight, every smoky tallow candle, every ray of light caught by a reflector was a small but important victory over the darkness. We saw that our ancestors were not helpless victims of the Dark Ages, but true masters of adaptation. They used everything that nature gave them: reeds, animal fat, pine resin, and even rotting mushrooms. They turned their homes into traps for light and heat, Their solutions were simple but ingenious in their effectiveness. By studying these forgotten methods, we not only learn more about the past, but we also learn a valuable lesson for the present. A lesson about the importance of valuing resources, finding out-of-the-box solutions, and the human spirit's ability to overcome any challenge. If you are interested in traveling through time and discovering the forgotten secrets of the Middle Ages, if you appreciate real stories about life, struggle, and survival, subscribe to our channel. New discoveries and exciting stories from the past that help you understand the present are waiting for you here. Don't miss out. There are many more amazing things to come.